And welcome back to the show. The Right to Remain Silent campaign is a statewide coalition to secure passage of legislation codifying New Yorkers' right to counsel before police interrogation. Well, the legislation modifies the Family Court Act and criminal procedures law, ensuring a child under the age of 18 may only be interrogated by law enforcement after a young person is consulted with counsel, thereby ensuring any waiver of rights under Miranda is genuinely knowing, voluntary, and intelligent. Joining us now to share a little bit more on the details of the matter, I'm joined by the National Director of the Youth Campaign and Leadership at the Gathering for Justice, Luis Hernandez. And Luis, good to have you.
Pleasure to be on. Great to speak about this topic. It's really important, and I'm glad that I can shed some light today.
Yeah, it really is important. And I think about the Central Park Five, and I think about their story. And I think about how your legislation actually correlates with that, what the legislation actually correlates with that story. Talk to us a little bit more about the rights of young people and why you feel so strongly about this.
Absolutely. I think at its core, children and young people from New York's Black and Brown communities particularly are vulnerable in an inequitable justice system. Centuries of wrongful incarcerations tell the stories of young people whose lives have been discarded because of coerced or false confessions. You mentioned Central Park Five, which is one of the most important stories that New Yorkers know. I mean, at least I grew up knowing the story of the Central Park Five, and the injustice that they experienced. But the Central Park Five are just five of hundreds of thousands of young people who have experienced wrongful incarceration because of false or coerced confessions. And that starts with the initial interrogation that happens with police officers and young people not having access to legal counsel. And it also isn't mandatory for young people to have legal counsel present during these interrogations. And we're talking about folks who we know are not mentally prepared to be under a surmountable amount of pressure, which is an interrogation. For any regular adult, being in an interrogation with police officers is nerve-wracking and frightening in a lot of ways. And just imagine how that is for a young person who's literally just looking to give a police officer any answers they could to just get out of that scenario.
Well, I want to look at some of the laws, right? And currently, let's take a look at New York State law, and let's look at what it does with particular regards to young people. Number one, police are allowed to interrogate a child without a parent or a guardian present. And then two, police can actually lie to a youth in order to induce that child to waive their right to remain silent. And we've seen that in several cases.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you highlighted Central Park Five, which I think is a common denominator here, especially because of the recent docu-series on Netflix, When They See Us. So many people are talking about this. So many people are talking about what we can do to prevent this. Yet we're not actually shifting and moving the policy. It's been over 3 decades since the Central Park Five, and yet still there isn't legislation in place that protects the regular procedural protocols of any other young person. I see in California, we've seen recent legislation pass. Across the country, we're seeing legislation being introduced as a result to When They See Us and the story of the Central Park Five, now that it's really once again reached a national platform and national attention. Yet in New York, legislators haven't acted. And I think this is a real opportunity to step up and really advance youth justice in a lot of ways. A lot of the conversation that we had recently during our public launch was, this is just the very start to what young people need when we talk about transformative justice and restoring justice and really creating environments that no longer are harming young people. And policing is at the core of it. When we talk about the protests that happened this summer, the ways in which young people were arrested for simply showing up on the streets. Oftentimes, there were young people being interrogated in those rooms, and likely if they have no counsel present, they're admitting to whatever the police officer wants them to admit, as long as it superficially means they get to leave, which we know that the longer term consequences is that they're eventually wrongfully incarcerated for things that they're not responsible for because they just had a false confession to be able to get out of the room.
Right. And we understand that 90% of young people, particularly in New York State, actually waived their Miranda rights. And when I looked at that, I thought that was quite startling.
Yeah, I mean, years of research by psychologists and sociologists and so many others have made it clear that even under controlled circumstances, children lack the capacity to fully appreciate the meaning and significance of their right to remain silent. It's a fundamental right that our Constitution gives us, right? And it's something that hasn't really been instilled in the lives of young people. I think a lot of what was highlighted in the conversation was specifically for families like mine, right? Coming from an immigrant household, our parents tell us cooperate with the police officer. They don't want to see us, or they don't want their child to end up on the news story at 5 o'clock as the next person, the next hashtag, the next person killed at the hands of police. And so what they tell us from a very young age is, if you're ever stopped, if you're ever brought in for questioning, if police interaction ever ensues, just tell them whatever they want you to tell them. Do whatever you have to do to get out of the situation. And that's sort of the practice that for years, generations of families have instilled into their children, not understanding that the detrimental effects that come with that when there's so many other factors at play in police precincts, specifically working with police officers who are simply trying to meet quotas, who are simply trying to secure their next arrest, secure their next rank. In these precincts, they're doing whatever they have to do to get any information, whether or not it's true. The authenticity of the story, facts are the least they care about. What they're thinking about is the next arrest, the amounts of arrests, the percentages of how many arrests they made stick and become crimes that are eventually tried in court, whether it's family court or criminal court. And these are the sort of situations that we're facing, especially when over 90%, as you noted, young people are waiving their rights to their Miranda rights. One, because they don't really know what the Miranda rights are. We all hear it and we all know it from infamous shows like Law and Order, but we don't really understand what that fundamental right means for us, as it pertains to the Fifth Amendment and what we have the right to actually do, not just as young people, but as people in America.
Well, I think the other challenge is when you talk about it from a child perspective, that's one thing, but also from a parent perspective. I want to look at a couple more and take a look at some of New York State's laws here. The police are not required to explain to the child and the child's parent or guardian what it is that the police want to question the particular youth about. And then police do not tell the child, the parent, and or guardian that the child can stop answering questions at any time the child chooses.
Right, right. And that's what I mean by practices that happen in police precincts that no one really knows about. Those are the underlying conditions that parents don't understand. If they don't have law degrees, if they're not practicing attorneys, these are things they don't know. And that's why we're really urging this piece of legislation, because it will require that legal counsel be present. A parent is great. Having that emotional support is amazing, but oftentimes our parents also don't know the legal framework that the police precincts follow or don't follow. And so when we have legal counsel present, we know these things. We know that we can stop talking at whatever time we want. We know that we do not have to answer any questions that the police officers have. Besides giving our name, our database, our date of birth, and potentially where we're from, police officers really don't need to know anything else. And if you speak to any defense attorney or any criminal or even civil attorney, the first thing they will tell their clients is, do not tell the police officers anything. Anything you say can actually be used against you. And that's what's read to young people as a part of their Miranda rights. But people don't necessarily understand what that entails. They don't understand the detrimental effects that one brief thing that you say in that interview with a police officer that eventually is being recorded or captured or noted somewhere can eventually be exactly what incriminates you during a trial proceeding.
And so when we look at this right here, the legislation has gone forward. Where do we see things moving as of right now?
We're in a really good place. The Senate has since introduced a bill. There's currently some legislative changes right now happening to the Assembly bill in the New York State legislature. And we both have Senator Jamal Bailey from the Bronx, as well as Assembly member Latoya Joyner, and so many others who are backing the bill. There's many co-sponsors. And so right now we're urging legislators across the state of New York to show up. If you're truly for Black lives, if you're truly in defense of young people, as many have publicly come out and stated over the past year, now is the time to show up, right? We need you all to talk to us in policy. Quite frankly, young people need these protections that should be protocol, that should be basic, that are simply meeting the needs of the constitutional rights of young people. But New York doesn't guarantee that right now. And so the legislation is moving along. Recently, we launched, again, the Right to Remain Silent campaign, which we had tremendous support by many elected officials. There's over 100 organizations. I believe the number is 170 organizations and political campaigns that have since backed this piece of legislation. So there's tremendous support across the New York State, and as well as the across the New York State legislature. And so now's the opportunity to pass the bill, but it's really up to the moral will of not just the New York State legislature, but also the governor. What are they willing to do right now in this moment to actually push forth this piece of legislation, especially in a budget year where they're going to try and use COVID-19 and our deficits as an excuse for not passing this bill.
Yeah. So you've heard from people who are critics on the other side. Are there many?
I mean, there's always going to be critics, but I think in this specific case, we're talking about something that's a fundamental right, and in a lot of ways, really indisputable. What a lot of people are coming forth with is really underlying, really superficial ideas of what could happen when counsel is present, or the stories of many of young people who have been wrongfully incarcerated potentially being reopened because of false confessions that have been used and shown up in court as ways to prosecute young people. So that's really what's coming up. But besides that, a lot of people and a lot of supporters have garnered around this piece of legislation because it really just meets basic needs. It's really answering to what should already be a fundamental right that children have.
Yeah. We talked at the top of the segment about the prominent piece of the Central Park Five and how that really has, when they see us, has really garnered the attention for a lot of people, not just across New York State, but across America. How much does that amplify your voice, given the fact that if that doesn't happen, if we don't see that movie, there is a chance that maybe many people aren't so quite aware?
Yeah, I think it provides a tool for us to use, and I think that's the lovely piece about storytelling. While it isn't completely factual and it isn't a documentary per se of the story of the Central Park Five, it captures a lot of the important elements that expose not only the New York Police Department but the New York State court system that has too often prosecuted children for crimes they didn't commit based on false confessions and coerced confessions. And so that's the reality that we face. I think we're in a really good place because we have the support of folks like the Central Park Five. Youssef Salam was someone who joined us for the public launch, and I'm honored in a lot of ways to be able to have been able to work with him over the years through my work here at the Gathering for Justice. And really, in this space, my immediate thought was we need to bring him in here, right? When we're building this coalition, when we're really creating a platform for young people to leverage their voices and provide testimonies, having that framework and that long-term analysis of what this not just this protocol or lack thereof of this protocol has done to young people is important. And Youssef Salam brought that exact really knowledge to it. He raised the alarms around the fact that it's been over 3 decades since, and legislation like this still doesn't exist, but also raised the alarms about the basic police practices that are happening across the state and what legislators are really charged to do now. They have the real responsibility as people who have been elected to represent New Yorkers to pass this legislation. Over the summer, we pushed and were able to garner enough support to repeal 50A, right? But things like that was a start. It was the very just scratching the surface of where we need to be in a state that claims to be so progressive.
Right. And we know that for those people who may not know, Dr. Youssef Salam is one of those that are exonerated from the Central Park Five, Dr. Youssef Salam. Share with us a little bit about that relationship and what has Dr. Youssef Salam been able to mean to you and the work that you're actually doing, and what have you learned from him?
Yeah, I think I've learned so much. One, I've known Youssef Salam at least over the 4 years. I met him when I came to the Gathering and Justice League. A lot of the work that I did initially in this space was really as an impacted person. I came to know the Justice League. I came to know a lot of this work after my brother was wrongfully incarcerated for over a year on Rikers Island. And myself and my mother had spent months really just trying to rake up any resources, calling the Bronx borough president, calling many elected officials, all to preliminarily be ignored, right? And my brother's story highlighted the effects of bail specifically in the bail system, and ever since, because of my brother's story and a lot of the work that we really pushed through the New York State legislature, we were able to see a lot of bail reform enacted. While there were many rollbacks this past year, which is another sort of conversation for another day, with many problems that we need to fix. But bail was one of the main issues in my brother's case that kept him incarcerated. And through that story and working with Youssef Salam and the rest of the Central Park Five, we were able to not just understand what my brother was necessarily going through, because I think oftentimes when they're in this situation, when they're currently really facing and enduring that trauma, their stories that, I mean, for example, my brother doesn't necessarily know how to articulate his own story because he's still enduring that trauma. He's still seeking it and doing his own, he's undergoing his own healing process that allows him to really come to a place where the Central Park Five is right now, where they're able to actively tell their stories as people who've experienced this as young folks. And being with them and in community with them has not only provided us with, and personally me, with the understanding of what my brother went through in that process, but also allowed us an opportunity to leverage not just my brother's story, not just their story, but these collective stories and experiences to push forth legislation, to really uplift our demands in many ways. And the Central Park Five has been a part of the Justice League NYC, which is the Gathering for Justice's New York-based task force community for years now. And in this space, a lot of the work that we've done collectively has really pushed forth a lot of our agendas here locally in the city, as well as in the state and other parts of the country. But over the past year, intentionally working with Youssef Salam and his daughter, Aaliyah Guillory Nickens, who's another young person, incredibly active and on the front lines of the movement. She's a member of Justice League NYC and has really also led a lot of the fight for this campaign, Right to Remain Silent, and also as someone who's been system impacted. She knows what it's like to be arrested at school and not just face the embarrassment, but face the realities of the school to prison pipeline. And these are things that young people, I mean, to know that even Yusuf Salam's daughter and many other folks are still enduring this, it just goes to show the track record of generational trauma that not having legal counsel and not having the support that we need perpetuates throughout generations.
Yeah, you spoke a little bit about real quickly. You spoke a little bit about your brother and him being at Rikers Island, knowing the story of Kalief Browder and knowing how his story ended up. How traumatizing was that for you?
I mean, I learned about Kalief Browder's story early on, right? And the onset of that was the scary experience of, could this happen to my brother, right? Because we know that Kalief eventually made it out of Rikers, but the detrimental things that they face are things that just can't be reconciled. I mean, from abuse to harm to really gaslight, toxins that they endure while being in Rikers Island are things that no one should have to experience, but are things that have long-lasting effects. And we've seen what happened, sadly, with Kalief Browder, right? And learning his story really put myself and my family in a place where what can we do immediately to secure the resources and things that we needed to secure to make sure that my brother didn't experience that. And so we were lucky enough to have the support of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization, who really was the organization who put up the money and really bailed my brother out over a weekend span after being introduced to us. Quickly thereafter, the Gathering for Justice, Justice League, and so many of the coalition partners that came together to free my brother, they really garnered and brought together a lot of resources to make sure that he had what he needed to not just survive, but to thrive as a young person who had been incarcerated for over 13 months on Rikers Island and faced those detrimental effects, particularly for a crime he didn't commit. And while that shouldn't be a negating factor of whether or not he has access to resources, that was the reality that he experienced, and really the reason why he got a lot of the support that he did.
Luis Hernandez, we're going to leave it there, but thank you so much for sharing with us, bringing us to light the issues that young people are facing and the legislation. We'll continue to follow the story and definitely have to bring you back.
Thank you. Pleasure to be on.
All right, Luis Hernandez, our guest here on the Social Justice Forums. Don't go anywhere. We'll return in a few.